Alone in a creaking house, something sinister lurks in the shadows.
I still hear her tiny voice calling for me, over and over, even though I know she's safe. That sound is burned into my mind, and I don't think I'll ever be able to erase it. It was supposed to be the perfect winter holiday, just me and my 6-year-old daughter Clara, at a cozy cabin I'd rented near a small town. The idea was to spend some quiet time together, away from the distractions of everyday life. The first 2 days were magical. We played board games, built a snowman outside, and spent hours curled up by the fire, reading her favorite storybooks. Everything felt so simple, so good, but the peace didn't last. It started on the 3rd day, when we ventured into town to get more supplies. Clara had insisted on coming along, her mittened hand clutching mine as we navigated the aisles of the small general store. She stopped suddenly, tugging at my coat. "Daddy, that man is looking at me," she said, her voice low. I turned and saw an older man near the canned goods. His weathered face turned in our direction. His eyes met mine briefly before he turned away, shuffling to another aisle. I told Clara not to worry, that he was probably just someone who liked kids. She nodded, but stayed closer to me the rest of the time. When we returned to the cabin, I didn't think much of it. I figured Clara's imagination had gotten the better of her, but then I noticed the boot prints in the snow leading from the road to our front porch. The problem was, we hadn't had any visitors, and I hadn't seen anyone come by. That night, Clara woke me up. "Daddy, someone's outside," she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her face was pale, and her big eyes glistened in the dim light from the hall. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, and listened. Sure enough, there was a faint crunching sound outside, footsteps in the snow. I crept to the window, careful not to disturb the curtains too much. In the faint moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, not moving, just watching the cabin. I froze, unsure of what to do. After a few seconds, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. The next morning, I checked the area where the figure had been standing. The snow was disturbed, confirming what I'd seen. Clara stayed inside while I walked the perimeter, looking for anything else out of place. I found a candy wrapper, crumpled and half buried in the snow. Clara didn't eat that kind of candy. I called the local sheriff, but he chalked it up to a trespasser or someone passing through. "Happens sometimes," he said dismissively. "Let me know if you see anything else." His tone suggested he didn't expect to hear from me again. That evening, Clara seemed quieter than usual. She kept looking out the window, her little brow furrowed in worry. I tried to cheer her up with a card game, but she wasn't interested. Finally, she said, "Daddy, I don't like it here anymore. Can we go home?" I promised her we'd leave first thing in the morning. I even packed most of her things before bed, eager to make a quick exit. But Clara didn't sleep well that night. She woke me up again, this time crying. "He's in the house," she whimpered. I grabbed the baseball bat I brought with me and told her to stay in the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I moved through the cabin, checking every door and window. Nothing was broken or unlocked, and I didn't see anyone. But when I got to the kitchen, I noticed the back door was open, just a crack. I could have sworn I locked it before bed. I shut and bolted the door, then stayed up the rest of the night. Clara eventually fell asleep again, but I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the events of the past few days, trying to make sense of it all. Who was that figure in the woods? How did the back door get opened? When morning finally came, I loaded Clara into the car as fast as I could. I didn't even stop to make coffee. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. We made it back home safely, but the experience has left me rattled. I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whoever it was might still be out there, waiting for another opportunity. And every so often, Clara will say something that sends a chill down my spine, like when she told me she saw the man's face through the window on our last night there. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can't stop wondering what might have happened if we'd stayed one more night. I thought the snowstorm was the worst of it, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It was a late December evening, and the forecast had been clear, a light dusting of snow. But as the night wore on, it escalated into a blizzard, blanketing everything in a thick white veil. I had just finished a long day of work and was looking forward to getting home. I didn't expect the roads to be as bad as they were, but within minutes of starting my drive, the snow began to fall harder, and the visibility dropped to nearly nothing. I couldn't even make out the edges of the road. I kept driving, hoping to make it to the next town where I could stop, get warm, and wait out the worst of it. The headlights barely cut through the snow, but then something strange happened. Out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. I tried restarting the car, but nothing happened. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any help. I could feel my anxiety rising, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd figure it out. I grabbed my phone, but no signal, not even a weak bar. That's when I saw it. A faint light flickered through the snow ahead, far off in the distance. At first, I thought it was another car, but as I squinted through the windshield, I realized it was too steady, too unmoving. The light was coming from an old house, one I didn't recognize. I wasn't familiar with any houses around here, and the fact that I hadn't passed one for miles made it even stranger. I debated whether I should try to find my way back to the main road or go toward the house. After a moment, I decided to take my chances with the house. What else could I do? I wasn't about to freeze in my car. I slowly maneuvered my car in the snow, steering toward the house. The closer I got, the more I noticed how isolated the place felt. It wasn't just remote. It looked abandoned. The windows were dark, the house crooked, as if it had been neglected for years. But the light was still on. I knocked on the door, and after a long pause, a man appeared. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with an expression that didn't seem welcoming. "Sorry to bother you," I said, trying to hide the panic in my voice. "My car broke down. Can I use your phone?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned me up and down, and for a moment, I felt like he was deciding whether to let me in. Finally, he stepped aside and waved me in. "Come in, but don't expect to stay long." I wasn't sure what to make of the cryptic remark, but I entered anyway. The warmth of the house hit me immediately, but it felt off, like the air was too thick, too heavy. Inside, the place was oddly well kept, considering the exterior. Everything was in its place, but there was an oppressive atmosphere to the house. I could feel it in my bones, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. The man offered me a seat by the fire, and I took it without hesitation. I didn't want to seem rude, but every fiber of my being was telling me something wasn't right. "Your phone's dead," the man said after a while, looking at the device in my hand. "No signal out here." I nodded, trying to hide my unease. "I just need a bit of help, and I'll be on my way," I said. "I'll wait for the storm to pass." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to a window and looked out into the storm. He stayed there for several minutes, not saying a word. Something about his demeanor unsettled me. After what felt like forever, he turned back to face me, and I froze when I saw the expression on his face. It was like a mask, hiding something far darker behind his eyes. "You're not the first to come looking for help here," he said, his voice colder than before, "and you won't be the last." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. He stood still for a long moment, just watching me, as though considering whether to reveal something. Finally, he spoke again, his tone almost a whisper. "The storm won't stop, not until it has what it wants." His words sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, but before I could say anything, there was a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the ground. The man's eyes widened in alarm, and he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to me. I knew it was too soon. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. What was that? What's going on here? The man seemed to snap out of whatever trance he was in, and looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "You need to leave," Now. I wasn't about to wait around to find out what was going on. I rushed to the door, but before I could open it, something caught my eye through the window. The snowstorm outside had become a full-blown blizzard, but what I saw through the glass was something much worse. Figures, shapes, moving in the snow, their outlines distorted in the storm. There was something wrong with them. Something wrong about how they moved. Too fluid, too fast, and they were heading toward the house. The man's hand shot out to stop me just as I tried to open the door. "Don't go out there," he said, his voice strained. "You won't survive the storm. Not with them out there." I stood frozen, staring at the figures outside. Whatever was happening, what are they? I asked, barely able to choke out the words. The man didn't answer. He simply stared at the door, as if waiting for something. Then, suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. The wind howled louder outside, and the sound of the figures moving closer filled the silence. I could hear the soft crunching of snow underfoot, but it wasn't coming from the storm. It was inside the house. The house knew I was trapped. My heart raced in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The flickering of the dim firelight seemed to cast shadows that didn't quite match the shapes in the room. I pressed my back against the door, my mind screaming for a way out, but every instinct told me that the man, this stranger, knew more than he was letting on. "I told you not to go outside," he repeated. It was as if the warmth had drained out of the room and everything that had been comforting moments before now felt suffocating. His gaze flickered toward the ceiling. "They're here." A cold shiver ran down my spine. What did he mean? Who was here? I glanced nervously around the darkened house, the unfamiliar noises of the storm outside growing louder. A distant creaking echoed through the house. I wasn't sure if it was the wind, but it sounded like footsteps, slowly getting closer. "Please, I need to know what's going on," I begged, my voice shaky. He didn't answer at first, his eyes fixed on the door, as though something or someone was right on the other side. I felt the weight of his silence pressing down on me like a physical force. And then the door handle began to rattle. It wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, like someone testing whether it was locked. My breath caught in my throat. The storm outside seemed to pause for a split second, and in that eerie calm, I could hear the distinct sound of someone breathing heavily. The man moved to the door quickly, locking it with a swift motion, his hand shaking for just a brief second. His eyes were wide now, and his breath came in shallow gasps. I had never seen someone so terrified. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It's not just the storm. They're coming for you now." Before I could even ask who they were, the floorboards above creaked loudly, followed by the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The house, which had seemed merely old and isolated, now felt like a prison. The man stepped back from the door, looking at me with a desperate expression. His lips trembled as he muttered under his breath, as if praying. Then he motioned to the stairwell that led up to the second floor. "They'll be here soon. You need to hide. Trust me." Hide? From what? The wind began howling outside again, louder than before, and the man's eyes were frantic now. His hands trembled as he pointed toward a small closet in the corner. "Go. You'll be safe there. It's the only place they can't find you." I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But before I could speak, the footsteps above became heavier, closer. There was no time left for questioning. I didn't want to, but I did, as he said, moving quickly toward the closet and slipping inside. The door shut behind me with a soft thud, and all I could do was hold my breath. I could hear the man moving around the room, his frantic movements growing louder. The footsteps above had stopped, but now there was a new sound, a scraping, something heavy dragging along the floorboards. My chest tightened, and I bit down on my lip to stifle the panic rising within me. From the small crack in the closet door, I could see the dim light from the fire flicker. Then, a loud crash. Something had broken in the other room. Waited for what felt like hours, my mind racing. My fingers trembled as I clutched the edges of my jacket, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart. I couldn't tell if the man was still in the room, if he was even alive, and the footsteps outside the door were so close now. Suddenly, the door to the closet opened with a loud creak, and I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat. It was a figure, a silhouette, standing in the doorway, obscured by the darkness of the house. I couldn't make out any features, just a tall, shadowy shape that seemed to fill the doorway. I froze, unable to move. My eyes locked on the figure, and I felt something shift in the air, like a presence that wasn't there just a moment before. I thought I knew what I was getting into, a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods to spend the holidays with my little brother. A quiet retreat, no distractions, just peace. But what I didn't know was that this place was hiding something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The snow was falling heavy when we arrived. It had been snowing for hours, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The cabin was isolated, no neighbors for miles. At first, it seemed like the perfect place to escape, the kind of place where you can hear nothing but the wind howling and the snow falling. But as soon as we walked inside, the air felt off. There was a musty smell in the air, like something had been sitting stagnant for too long. My brother was too excited to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. We lit a fire, settled in, and played a few games to pass the time. But as night fell and the snow continued to fall heavier, the house began to feel smaller. The walls seemed to close in, and there was an odd creaking sound that came from the second floor. It was loud enough to make me look up, but I saw nothing. I checked the windows, and everything outside was still and white, nothing out of place. Later that night, after my brother had gone to bed, I heard the floor creak again, followed by a faint, deliberate tapping. It came from upstairs, just outside the door to the room we were sleeping in. I froze. My first thought was that it was just the house settling, but then it happened again. A soft tap, 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 like someone or something was waiting just outside. I got up and grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. You may close your eyes and allow your attention to rest within you and your body. I opened the door slowly, listening for any movement. There was nothing. I checked the windows again. No footsteps in the snow, no sign of anyone nearby. The cabin seemed like it was sealed off from the rest of the world, but the tapping continued. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed up, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I told myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a tree branch tapping against the window or the wind playing tricks on me. But as we were packing to leave, I found something that made my stomach drop. A footprint in the snow that led right up to the cabin door. It wasn't from the night before, I could tell. The snow around it was untouched, fresh. My brother was playing inside, oblivious, while I stood frozen in place, staring at the footprint. It was too big to belong to anyone we knew, too clear to be anything but deliberate. I followed the trail, cautiously, hoping to find some explanation. The footprints led to the back of the cabin, then abruptly stopped. Nothing. No more tracks in the snow, just an eerie stillness. I searched the area for a while, but the silence was suffocating. I called out to my brother, my voice wavering, and then I heard the most chilling sound, the front door of the cabin creaking open behind me. I rushed back, only to find the door wide open. My heart dropped into my stomach as I called for my brother. No response. I ran inside and found him sitting in the living room staring at the window with a blank expression. When I asked him what he was doing, he simply said, "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "For them," he replied, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. His words sent a chill through me. Who was he waiting for? I checked the cabin, locking every door and window, trying to calm my racing mind. That's when I noticed something else. The fire in the hearth was out, and the chimney was completely blocked. No smoke was coming out. It was as if the cabin was trapped in time, sealed off from the outside world. Then the tapping started again, But this time, it was different. It was coming from inside the walls. Slow, deliberate, like someone was moving just beneath the floorboards. The walls creaked and groaned, and I could feel the house breathing as though it were alive. I grabbed my brother and we huddled together, terrified of what might be on the other side of the walls. I don't know how long we sat there in the dark, waiting for the tapping to stop. It didn't. It only grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was hidden in the walls was trying to get out. The cabin felt like it was closing in on us, suffocating us in its icy grip. In the early hours of the morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay there another night. I bundled my brother up, packed our things, and rushed out into the storm. The snow was falling harder than ever, but I didn't care. I couldn't look back. As we walked away from the cabin, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window, watching us. But when I turned to look again, it was gone. I don't know what was in that cabin. I don't know who or what was waiting for us. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, waiting for us to return. And no matter how far I run, I can still hear the tapping in the walls. The snowstorm had picked up even more by the time we left the cabin, the visibility so poor that the road ahead barely seemed to exist. My hands were numb from the cold as I gripped the wheel of the car, trying to push forward, but my mind kept drifting back to the cabin. The fear from earlier still clung to me, making every sound feel like a potential threat. It wasn't until we reached the small town nearby that I felt a slight sense of relief. The lights from a diner reflected through the snow, a warm beacon that felt like a sign of safety. I pulled into the parking lot, too exhausted to keep driving. We could stop for a moment, take a breath, and get something warm to drink before making the final stretch home. When we entered the diner, the warmth hit us instantly, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't matter. But as I walked up to the counter to pay for some hot chocolate, I caught a conversation between two older men sitting by the window. Their voices were low, but I heard enough to make my skin crawl. "They're back," one of them muttered. "The winter walkers are restless this time of year," the other replied. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the words felt too familiar. I thought about asking them what they meant, but decided against it. Something about the way they spoke, the gravity in their voices, made me hesitate. Instead, I sat down at a booth, keeping my brother close to me as I tried to push the thought of the cabin out of my mind. After a while, we left the diner, and the drive back to the city was uneventful. We made it home just as the snow began to settle. My brother was quiet in the back seat, probably tired from the long day, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, when I went through the bags to unpack, I found something I hadn't noticed the night before. It was a small note tucked in my jacket pocket. Something I hadn't seen when I was gathering things from the cabin. My heart sank as I read it. "It's not over, don't come back." The handwriting was unfamiliar. It was neatly written, but there was an unsettling sense of finality to it, as if the message was meant for me specifically. But how? We'd left the cabin. Who could have known we were there? I showed the note to my brother, but he seemed unfazed, like he didn't even recognize it. I was about to brush it off as some kind of prank when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short. "The house knows you left, but you're not safe yet." I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at the message, my hand shaking as I put the phone down. My thoughts were racing, trying to figure out how this could all be connected. I tried calling the number, but the line was dead. No response, just the sound of silence on the other end. Days passed, and I tried to resume some semblance of normal life, but the feeling of being watched, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin again, the figure in the window, the walls that seemed to breathe. And then, one night, as I lay in bed, I heard something. A soft tapping at the window. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. This tapping was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The tapping persisted, growing louder and faster until it seemed to shake the walls. My heart raced as I got up to check, but when I pulled back the curtains, there was nothing there. The street outside was quiet, covered in a fresh layer of snow, but the tapping didn't stop. It moved to the door. I could feel it through the walls, hear it in my bones, as if the house itself was trying to get inside. My breath hitched in my throat, and I glanced at the phone on my nightstand. Should I call someone? Who could help me? Then I heard a voice, a whisper. It was faint, distant, but it felt close, right in my ear. You can't escape. My blood ran cold as I turned around, my eyes scanning the room, desperate for some sign of reality, some assurance that I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing. No one. And yet, the tapping continued. The feeling of dread settled deeper into my chest. The house felt like a cage, and the walls seemed to grow closer, suffocating me with every passing second. I had left the cabin. I had driven far away, but it felt like something was still chasing me. Whatever was waiting there, it wasn't done with me yet. The house, the walls, they knew. And whatever was waiting for me wasn't just a memory. It was real, and I had no idea how to stop it. I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't over. And the worst part, I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to escape.